Good evening. I can't tell you what a treat it is for me to be able to interview Jonathan after having read your book, which was just enthralling, but also as we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. And to read your book in the context of Dr. King's life and understanding that the march was such a small portion, as large as it still looms, of his life. I just want to thank you for your book and for how it has really allowed us to return to the life's work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Thank you.
But I want to start a little bit before the book because we know that you were a Wall Street Journal reporter, and we know that you decided at some point during that career, I'm going to write books. But you didn't just write books. You wrote biographies. You wrote biographies of Al Capone, Muhammad Ali, of Lou Gehrig, and now of Dr. Martin Luther King. Why biographies, and why those individuals? And did you find something, Jackie Robinson was in that group, a central theme to those individuals?
That's a great question. Thank you, Karen. I'd like to say that there was a grand plan, that I had this brilliant strategy, that I had mapped it all out, but I didn't. And I suspect that most of us in our careers would find that it was one thing led to another, and that if we're lucky, we find a thread that connects it all, but sometimes we don't. In my case, it was really just my training as a journalist, my curiosity, and my desire to try to tell the biggest and best and most important stories that I could. And as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, I had a fairly high level of success writing about big, important things, but whenever, as any journalist can tell you, and I know at least one journalist friend in the room, it feels ephemeral sometimes, that people don't remember what you wrote because they throw it away the next day. And I began to think about writing books, and it occurred to me, while reading Seabiscuit actually, that biography and sports is probably the easiest way in. It just seemed like reading that book, I could figure out how she did it, and that maybe I could duplicate it. And I was looking for an idea of a subject that allowed you to tell a story about sports that was more than sports. And Lou Gehrig just occurred to me because it's really an American tragedy. It's about a man dying in his prime and finding the courage to go on, and finding the courage to even to go public with his illness at a time when very few people did that. And that just led me on a great run that I've been so blessed to have for the last 20 years, where I've been writing books full time. And after going from Gehrig, I thought the book was relatively well received, and my editor wanted me to do another baseball book. There was only one other baseball player that I thought was interesting enough, whose story was about more than baseball, and that was Jackie Robinson.
Sure.
And I was fortunate enough to get Mrs. Robinson to agree to work with me and tell me about their life together. And from there, it's just been trying to find the best and most important stories that I can possibly tell. And I do think that I have noticed a thread over time, and that I tend to be writing about rebels. And it was not intentional, but I think that I'm drawn to that, maybe because I'm a short guy, or because I'm Jewish, or because I'm a journalist. But I identify with the rebel, and maybe because I'm an American too, for that matter. But when you look at the books, I think that if there's a thread that runs through them, that might be it.
Well, certainly we saw aspects of Dr. King's life that showed that he was, in fact, a rebel, but a rebel for justice. Interestingly, in your research of Dr. King, you found an unpublished manuscript. And I'm really curious about, how did you find it? What did you do when you found it? And how did it inform your writing about Dr. King?
Well, one of the things you start out with when you begin writing a book about somebody as well known as King is you have to prove to your publisher that you're going to have something new to say. And one way you do that is by finding new source material. The problem is that you can't really find that source material until you spend years of research, and you're asking the publisher to give you a contract in advance. So you sort of promise, hey, I think I'm going to find some new material. The autobiography of Daddy King, as everybody called him, Martin Luther King Sr., as everybody referred to as Daddy King, I didn't find until like the last 6 months of this book project. But I did find other things early on that gave me confidence that there was a vast supply of new material. I'll give you one other example, and then I'll answer your question about Daddy King. One of the first things I do when I start working on any project is look at the other books that are out there and look at the source materials for those books. And the very first biography of Martin Luther King was written in 1957 by Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who was an African-American historian and archivist at the Alabama State University, and who volunteered to help out with the Montgomery bus boycott, and while he was there started interviewing King and wrote a biography. And I thought to myself, where are his notes? Where are his papers? What happened to the interviews that didn't make it into the book? It turns out that he stayed with King throughout his entire career, became the official archivist of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization, and kept files from every meeting. He went with King and Coretta to India, just the three of them. And all of his files were at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, and nobody had opened the boxes yet. So
incredible.
That came early. So I knew pretty early on that I was going to have at least one important new source of material. And then maybe about halfway through the research, I was doing genealogical research on the King family, trying to figure out where and by whom they might have been enslaved. And in one genealogical study on the Kings, I found mention of an autobiography by Martin Luther King Sr. that had never been published. So I thought, well, how did this genealogist find it if it's never been published? It turns out the King Center in Atlanta had it, but didn't even know they had it until I told them it was that it was in a box there. And I can't even tell you how I got it because I wasn't supposed to have access to it. So to answer your question, I was thrilled, I was ecstatic. I shared it immediately with scholars, other scholars in the field, because I wanted to spread this information. And I immediately sent copies to all of the King children in the hopes that they might come around and cooperate with me on the book, which they didn't. But I've continued to share as much of my research material with them as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the King children and that they did not come around. In fact, we know that throughout the course of time, they have denied the fact that their father had extramarital affairs, and you are very clear in your research and just really discussing it, and certainly you had the assistance of the surveillance tapes in that instance. Talk a bit about that and how you felt about their reticence, and certainly how you were able to balance what you discovered and what you wrote about in the context of Dr. King's iconic reputation.
That was probably the most delicate part of writing this book, and I was very concerned about how it would be perceived because this is the first book written since the release of thousands of pages of FBI documents in which we can read the transcripts of King's conversations on the phone. We don't have the tapes. The tapes are scheduled to be released in 2027.
Sure.
But I knew, and other people had reported on some of the tapes, the transcripts that had been released. And we are fairly confident that those transcripts are accurate because the people who are still alive, whose voices are recorded on those tapes, have read the transcripts, Andrew Young, among others, and said that that's what he said. He's recorded on the phone with Martin Luther King, and he's read the transcripts, and he said the transcripts are accurate. So we have hundreds of pages of King on the phone with women, and I have no reason to believe that those transcripts are inaccurate. And it's fairly conclusive. And I also interviewed people who knew King and knew some of the women that he was having affairs with, and they told me that it was true, that King was in relationships with these women, primarily with Dorothy Cotton, who was a high-level member of the SCLC, an important activist in her own right, and what some of King's friends referred to as his second wife. Sure. So I felt fairly confident that it was accurate, and I felt like it was important to be honest with my readers and to acknowledge King's flaws, but it's also important because it's the weapon that the FBI used to try to destroy him. True. they had no reason to continue surveilling him once they determined, originally the surveillance was authorized by Robert F. Kennedy because they were concerned about King's association with former members of the Communist Party of the United States. When it became clear very quickly from listening to those conversations that they were not discussing communism, they were discussing the opposite. They were discussing how to make our democracy greater. But at the same time, so they should have stopped the surveillance right then and there. They did not. And in that meantime, they had heard him on the phone with women, and that became the obsession of J. Edgar Hoover, and he determined that was the best weapon in his arsenal to try to destroy King, damage the civil rights movement, and maintain the existing white power structure that he was so fond of. And that is another reason why it's important, I think, to acknowledge King's human flaws. And then the final reason is to, we can't ask anybody to step up and lead if they have to be perfect, because none of us are perfect. Sure. So that's just an important message for this book, I think, too.
Absolutely. So you really do treat the contributions of women in a way that has not necessarily been treated by other biographers. I'm talking specifically about Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Coretta Scott King.
Amen.
And women who really did, Amelia Boynton, who I had the great honor of meeting. And these are women who had a tremendous impact on the movement. Do you think that we really see the full impact of their work and the strategies that were employed or deployed during the movement? Or do you think that had they been able to play a much more visible role, there would have been more success earlier and more lasting success?
That's a great question. In general, I say that women need to be more empowered, and things are always better when women are in charge. Shout out to my wife and daughters. And King had a real blind spot, and some of it comes from being a Baptist minister, and the entire organization, the SCLC, was run by Baptist ministers, sure. And they were raised in an environment in which women were meant to run the choirs primarily, and they were not given powerful leadership roles in their churches, in their communities, and that's just the way he was raised. And you would like to think that he would have progressed, that he would have advanced. Certainly, he has an opportunity when he meets Coretta, and I love Coretta Scott King, and I love the fact that King married her because he was a player. He had all kinds of women. He was dating 3 or 4 women at a time, pretty much his entire single life. Why Coretta? It's because she was an activist. That's why he fell in love with her. And he could have turned a corner in that moment. She was certainly trying to push him around that corner. She was trying to say, I want to be involved. I feel called to this by God just the way you do. I want to be out on the front lines with you. And he said, no, you got to stay home and be the housewife and take care of the kids. And then other really competent women, some of them who you mentioned, Miss Baker was briefly appointed to be the temporary executive, the acting director of the SCLC. And if he had only given her the job, it would have saved him so much stress. He needed a competent administrator, a competent organizer, and she was the best. And he didn't see it, and he kept hiring one man after another who failed him. So King is one of our greatest, most progressive fighters for equality and justice, but he has a blind spot when it comes to women.
Sure. So let's talk about a little bit about the surveillance tapes, because they started under the Kennedy administration. It was John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and then continued through the Johnson administration with President Johnson and Ramsey Clark. Mm-hmm. King, I think, had a really good relationship with Bobby Kennedy. In fact, he raised money for him.
Right.
I think the same can be said at one point for Lyndon Johnson. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about the inconsistency between, on the one hand, tapping his phones, and on the other hand, really crediting King with the work that he was doing and his efforts relative to the civil rights movement, and even working in partnership with him. How did those men reconcile that, and what role did it play in King not being more cautious, quite frankly, about the fact that he was under surveillance?
It's so incredibly complicated. King has high hopes for the Kennedys. They pretty much owe their election to the Black Americans who turned out to vote at the last minute. And King is constantly disappointed that they're not delivering anything in return for that strong support. And yet he keeps working, keeps pushing, finally gets the Kennedys to come on board and to declare their determination to pass civil rights legislation. And yet they're still surveilling him. And some of that goes back to the politics of the day. There was genuine paranoia about Communist Party infiltration of the United States, and I think they were genuinely concerned that communists might infiltrate the civil rights movement and turn it. But once it became clear, and it should have been clear, and King kept saying over and over that it would make no sense. Everything they're doing is to prove that America is the land of freedom and equality. This is a deterrent to communism, everything we're doing. The Kennedys still didn't get it, and that's because they're politicians. And I think we see this fundamental disconnect with Kennedys and with Johnson. And some of it is King's fault too, in that he can't really wrap his head around how politicians think.
Right.
He's not Machiavellian enough. He's not mercenary enough. He's not thinking about power. There were many opportunities where he could say to the president, yes, I'm here in he's on the phone with LBJ during the LA riots several times a week. And I'm here, I'm on the ground, what can we do? And Johnson is desperate for his help. And at that moment, anybody with a sense of how politics works would say, listen, I'm here for you, Mr. President, but I gotta ask, while we're talking, any chance you could get J. Edgar Hoover off my back?
Yeah.
And LBJ had the power to do that, not only because he was buddies with Hoover, he was neighbors with Hoover, but he had kind of a blank check for a while when he took office. And if he'd wanted to get rid of Hoover, he certainly could have. But Kennedy doesn't, the King doesn't really understand how to function that way. He doesn't understand why these political leaders aren't more moral, why they're not guided by their consciences. And I think the politicians on the same time think King's naive, right, that he doesn't know how to play the games. And that hurts King. And I think it hurts Johnson too. I think it hurts the Kennedys too, because they can't really communicate.
Absolutely. So I want to bring this home to Chicago, because you provide a detailed portrayal, quite frankly, of Dr. King's time here in Chicago, and quite frankly, the reaction of the citizens here, the violent and visceral reaction of not only the everyday citizens in certain parts of the community, but also the reaction of Richard J. Daley and Senator Dirksen, who were less than warm and fuzzy towards King. How does that Chicago of 1966, where there was significant segregation, hyper-segregation, if you will, differ from the Chicago today, where segregation still exists and where there is a racial wealth gap? And what can we learn as leaders today about transforming Chicago today?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm going to ask you to reflect on the last part of that question. But King, I wrote this book for a number of reasons. One, because I wanted to provide a more human, intimate portrait of King. I wanted to remind people that he was a man and not a monument. And I wanted people to be able to understand that he had flaws, and yet he persevered, that he was guided by his religious faith, and that meant more to him than anything else, that when he was threatened, when he was challenged, when he had doubts, he would persevere because he felt truly that he was doing the right thing, and this is what God wanted him to do. That's the kind of man he was. I also wrote this book because I wanted to point out some of the parallels between racial dynamics in the 1950s and 60s and today. And I think that one reason you need new biographies every couple of years, or certainly every generation, is because we can understand the events of the past when we face them and reflect on them in our own lives. And what happened when King got to Chicago is very much what happens today when protest movements arise. The people in power find a way to either squash them or wait for them to die down, and they can turn their backs on them. They form a committee and announce that they're studying them. And what happened in Chicago, and King was told not to come here. Right. He was told, you don't understand Northern segregation. You don't understand Northern politics. Stick to the South, stick to focusing on voting rights, do what you're good at, and you can make a difference. And in some ways, those advisors were right. He would have been more effective in the long term if he had just stuck to the South. But that's not what his religious and that his moral beliefs told him to do. He said the segregation in the North is just as bad, just better disguised. The racism in the North is just as bad, just better disguised. And I can't keep calling on Northerners to fund my campaigns in the South and not point it out to them. It would be hypocritical. And he was definitely not a hypocrite. So he chose Chicago in part because he thought it was better organized than some of the other cities he was considering, that there was already a fairly strong community movement here. But as Tim Ewell Black explained to me, he still didn't really understand what he was getting into. That he didn't understand that not all of the black preachers in town were going to support him, that some of them were going to be loyal to Daley. He didn't understand what a huge chunk of the black community was going to be loyal to Daley because their jobs or their uncle's jobs depended on it, on the mayor and on the patronage system. And he didn't really have enough workers on the ground. He didn't have any kind of an organization. So he came in here and he persisted. You know, he showed the world the racism by marching through Marquette Park and Gage Park, and he called attention to these problems, and he really put enough pressure on Daley that Daley, you know, agreed to sit down and agreed to a series of concessions. He met a lot of King's demands and then ignored them once King left town. Right. And that's the tragedy we live with today. King presented our city an opportunity, and they were concrete, specific suggestions for how to start working against community segregation, school segregation, discrimination in hiring. They were concrete policy reforms, and he presented them to the mayor, and the mayor basically walked away, ignored it. So what do we do today? I'd like to answer. I'd love to punt that one to you.
Oh, no, we're not turning the table.
Well, that's what we'll discuss in our group sessions, because I'm not prepared to answer that yet.
Well, you know, and I think that's really the opportunity for all of us to determine whether we will continue to study it, you know, committee formed,
right,
or whether we will recognize what our blind spots are as a community and do something about them. So I think that's the opportunity that we have on the eve, or as we commemorate, rather, the 60th March of the March on Washington, the 60th anniversary. I think the interesting thing about it was that it wasn't just about racism, right? It was about poverty. It was about unequal pay. It was about voting rights. All of those things. What struck me about the book was that there were so many parallels with the 50s and the 60s and today. It was almost frightening.
Yeah.
Particularly as it portrayed democracy. Mm-hmm. And so that's a real opportunity. I have this question for you. You met some very interesting people. You talk about Tim Ewell Black. and the others who were still alive, Andy Young. You obviously didn't have an opportunity to meet Dr. King or Coretta Scott King, and I suspect had you had the opportunity, you would. Who else in the book would you have loved to have met had you been given the opportunity? Because one of the things that is so remarkable to me about your book is that you make them all come to life. So tell me who you didn't meet. Who else did you not meet that you would have, other than Dr. King and Coretta Scott?
Well, there were so many who passed away before I got started. I wasn't smart enough to start this book, 10, 20 years earlier. So certainly Bayard Rustin, what a fascinating character. Dorothy Cotton would have been very high on my list. And she was still alive when I began, but she had dementia and couldn't do an interview. Ralph Abernathy. Oh, Ralph Abernathy was King's best friend, who knew that King had an unusual, everyone is afraid of going to jail. Black people in particular in the South are especially afraid of going to jail. It's life-threatening and seriously life-threatening.
Sure.
But Ralph Abernathy understood that King had a particular paranoia about being isolated, and he would intentionally get arrested along with King so that he could be in the squad car. And nobody understood King like Ralph Abernathy. And Abernathy was eviscerated when he wrote his memoirs in the 80s because he told the truth about King's personal life, and it destroyed Abernathy's reputation. I would have loved to have talked to Abernathy. There's so many, but I'm just really grateful, and it's one of the great gifts of my life is that I interviewed scores of people who knew Martin Luther King personally, and I was smart enough. It's one of the few smart things I've done in my life, professionally, personally. I've made some smart decisions, but I was smart enough to realize that this was the last chance to travel the country and interview people who knew King personally, from everyone from his barber to his childhood friend down the block, and legends like Dick Gregory and Harry Belafonte. So these last 6 years have been a real blessing.
So I know that we are still enjoying the book. Before I turn to the audience, so you all can get ready, what's next? What's on deck?
I don't know yet. I have to be honest. I'm searching. I have a couple of ideas for the next book, but I haven't settled on one yet. The problem is it's a really tough act to follow. I thought when I wrote my Muhammad Ali book that I was never going to be able to come up with anything as big, as important, as much fun as that book, and I topped it with King, and I don't know that I gotta recalibrate my expectations and find something that I feel passionate about, but I don't know that I'm ever going to come up with anything as important as King, because this just really feels like a book that has connected with people in a way that you dream of, really.
Absolutely. So it's your turn. Questions from our audience. Yep.
My question is, an article in May about Martin Luther King, about your book, and the concept of respectability politics was highlighted. I wonder if you have thoughts about that to share.
Yeah, I love that article, and I think that part of understanding why King was successful, why he was the right man at the moment, and in 1955, when he emerged as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, it was almost by accident. It was the women of Montgomery who had really prepared and organized for that moment, and they just needed somebody to stand up there and be their spokesman. And really, King was chosen just to be the spokesman. And we think about why that was the case, and why he clicked, and why he became a national, worldwide figure. A lot of it is because he presented an image at the time that everybody could respect. Certainly the black people in the audience, the community, even those who'd never heard him before, immediately connected with him because he was a brilliant preacher. He spoke the language of the South. He was from Georgia. His parents and grandparents were preachers. He could connect with anybody in the church, but he also had this incredible ability to connect with the media, with white people at home seeing him on TV. So that element of respectability and that the fact that he was always dressed conservatively, he was seen as a conservative to many people, and when white reporters wrote about him, they would say, you don't have to worry about him. He's not scary like some of these other black activists. And he was scarier. I think he was, if you look at it and you look at what he was accomplishing and what he was trying to accomplish, he was far more threatening to the white power structure than Malcolm X. But it presented this image of respectability that I think really served his cause well.
I know you're not a prognosticator, but had Dr. King not been tragically assassinated, do you think ultimately he would go and teach at a university and preach at his church? Or do you think he would continue to fight for civil rights, whatever the topic of the day was, until the day he passed?
That's a great question, and I asked Andrew Young that recently. I saw him in Georgia a couple of weeks ago, because he was a little upset. He thought that the book made it sound as if King was running out of gas, that he was so depressed in the last years of his life, and he said he was never going to quit. And it's worth noting that King originally wanted to preach for a few years and then become a college professor. That was his goal, and maybe to run Morehouse someday. And he actually went on a job interview in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott at the Dillard University Chapel, and I think it was Dillard, and the construction was going slowly on the chapel. They said, well, we're going to need another year before we can offer you the position. And if the construction had moved along a little quicker, we might have lost Martin Luther King to a career in academia.
Thank you for writing a very compelling book. My question is a follow-up on the sources you interviewed. Did you consider or try to interview people who were on the opposing side of Dr. King? The descendants of the sheriffs who attacked him or the person who punched him. I looked up the names, and many of them would appear to be still alive or in their 80s. I was just wondering if you had that perspective.
Yeah, I did try to interview some of them, and I tried to track down some of the FBI agents who were doing surveillance. I did talk to one guy, this was a really memorable interview in Selma, who was one of the lawyers opposing King's right to march in Selma, and his father was the city attorney and worked with his father in the law firm, and I went with him, drove in his car across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he showed me where he was parked as he watched the police beating the protesters as they came across the bridge. And he sat there with me in the car and said, I could have said something, but I didn't. And he was clearly haunted by that. I could have said something to my father, but I didn't. And it's interesting to see how people, change over time, and how many of them have apologies for the way they behaved at the time, and we all find ways, I guess, to justify our choices.
Thank you. Hi there, Leslie Smith. Again, thank you for writing a very compelling novel or book. I spent 8 years in Memphis and feel a deep connection to Martin Luther King Jr. because of the impact it's had on that place. Having him been murdered there and the ongoing sort of plight of the humans that live there. And so I think it's important, to your point about bringing back historical figures to remind us of where we've been. I also think presenting them in their imperfect form gives us all the freedom to be called to action without the need to be perfect. My question for you: is this book, given where we are today, which is very similar to where we were then, and in many ways seeing our rights and opportunities erode on a daily basis, is this book for you a warning or a call to action?
It's a biography. No, but I think books, when present an opportunity to serve as a warning and a call to action, they mostly serve as a call to empathy. They ask you to occupy someone else's life for a while. And listen, I can't really tell you what Martin Luther King was like. It's an impossible task to write a biography. You're doing your best to try to analyze and interpret and research someone's life. And when the reader takes up that task, it's the same thing. You can't really ask to become Martin Luther King or to drop everything and change your life, but it offers you the opportunity to reflect on what we have done wrong and what we can do better. So I'm writing this book as Donald Trump is taking office, as the riots are occurring in Charlottesville, as George Floyd is being murdered, And of course, all of that is affecting my psyche, and I feel myself getting angry at times writing the book. So it's a scream, it's a call to action, it's a prayer. The book begins with a prayer and it ends with the word amen. That is not an accident.
Thank you for writing a wonderful book. I really appreciate it. I was wondering, thinking about the wiretap that you were talking about, those are supposed to be reviewed every 90 days. They were never reviewed in this
right.
case, through the Kennedys, through Johnson. Did you ever discover or think that perhaps they weren't reviewed or revoked because those people were afraid what J. Edgar Hoover may have on them?
There's no question about that. And Robert F. Kennedy recorded interviews that were sealed for, I can't remember, 25 years, in which he talked about that directly. And he was, when he reauthorized, he said, I want to reassess this in 90 days, and he never did. And he said directly that he and his brother were threatened by Hoover, that they had information, that Hoover had information on a hotel scene involving the Kennedys, and that he threatened to release it. So that absolutely is one of the factors. They were absolutely afraid of J. Edgar Hoover.
Okay. So again, thank you for the most incredible book. I think it's the best biography I've ever read. It was a page turner, yet we know exactly how it ends, and I could not put it down. The parts about Marquette Park and Gage Park have given me PTSD. I grew up there. While I was only 3 when Martin Luther King marched through my neighborhood, it impacted my family's life tremendously in the road that I went down in a positive way. So I'm really grateful for that. But it was just harrowing to read that again and to see the pictures. And I just kept hoping there was nobody I knew in those pictures. But my question is really about Vietnam. It figured so prominently in the book, and yet, and the criticism that he received from everybody, of course, from Johnson and from Hoover, but like his own base and his own supporters. I just wonder if you could talk for a minute or two about like how his call to sort of ending this military occupation and the death of hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, sort of impacted the last years of his life.
No, thank you. That's a great question. And it ties into his decision to come to Chicago, because he decided over and over again that as he grew more powerful and had more access to power, that he needed to be true to his beliefs. And maybe going to Chicago was a bad move politically, but he had to do it anyway because it was what he believed was important. And the same thing with Vietnam. He'd been preaching nonviolence, and how could he not call out, as he described it, the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, the United States government in Vietnam? He was on the phone with LBJ trying to stop the riots in Los Angeles, and he felt like it's hypocritical for me to try to stop the fighting here and not talk about the greater problem. And he suffered for it tremendously. His popularity ratings fell tremendously. Even in 1963, though, we're celebrating the anniversary, 70% of Americans opposed the March on Washington because they feared that there would be a violent outbreak. But it only got worse from there. By 65, 66, 67, King had negative approval ratings, like 67% of Americans disapproved of Martin Luther King. And the Vietnam thing, the war was still popular at that time. And I'll just conclude with one thing that I want to mention. Even King's supporters, even King's closest advisors, one of his best friends, Stan Levison, after he gave his most profound Vietnam speech on April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church in New York, Levison calls him the next day and said, I didn't like that speech. It didn't sound like you. It's going to cost us a lot of support in the North. You can't walk that back with LBJ. Like, I just don't think it was a good idea. And we know this, what King said, because we have the FBI transcripts of his recording, of his phone call. And he said, I thought you knew me. Haven't you been listening to anything I've been saying all these years? I didn't do it because it was the politically right thing to do. I did it because it was the morally right thing to do. And he even has to explain that to one of his closest friends at that point in his life. It's just heartbreaking.
Yes, a lot of the greatest actors in our history become so because they could pick the right script, the right character, the right drama to perform in. So what is it about you that you're able to pick the right person to do a biography of? And are there criteria that you kind of think of in your head mentally when you're trying to decide who in this universe of great people I'm going to do a biography of next?
Wow, that's a really good question. And I would just say that I'm looking for people who have the courage to stand up for their convictions. And, even Al Capone falls into that category. I prefer the good guys, and I don't think I'll be going back to do bad guys again. But when I think about choosing biography subjects, I'm thinking for how is it relevant to the world we're living in today? Is it something I feel passionate enough about to spend 6 years of my life working on? And is it something that people might take some inspiration from? And I think if it checks those boxes, then I'm interested. Thank you very much.